Hello everyone, sorry that I'm slow as a tortoise, but finally it is time that I take a look and review the apex game that has been taking the board game world by storm the last few months, and that is Ark Nova. Let's see if it's able to live up to all the hype. So Ark Nova is a game about building up a zoo in order to gain both appeal points for citizens visiting your zoo, as well as conservation points to help make the world a better place. You will have a playmat like this where you will be building up your zoo, gathering animals, hiring experts, and performing different actions. The game itself will consist of a much bigger area, but right now we're just showing your board because when it's your turn, you'll be choosing one of these actions to do. Depending on which action you choose and which slot it's in will determine its strength, telling you what is possible for it to interact with. You'll do things such as building. This will be putting these buildings into your map, making sure they fit within the hexagons. Some of them are enclosures to fit animals. Some of them have special abilities. Playing animals will be actually playing animals from your hand into enclosures that they can survive in. Animals will have not only a minimum requirement of kind of enclosures they can fit in size-wise, but also a cost in terms of this generic-looking money, and as well as maybe some other symbols here that aren't present. You'll see them more on something like this that tell you what you need. They also will provide some symbols, as many cards will play off each other from what kind of animal they are or what continent they're from. They also have a special ability listed here, usually triggered as soon as you play it, as well as some points, usually appeal points because people are excited to see the new animals. Cards is simply drawing more cards from the main area, which we'll get to a little bit later. Skipping over association for a second, sponsor will be how you really hire your main cast here of experts. And now going back to association, this is where you're going to really focus on your connections in whether making partners with universities or zoos from other continents, and also where you're really going to focus on getting those conservation points. But that will require us to look at some of the other boards present in this game. Before we switch over the boards, I want to just focus on the final little areas here. This is just where you put all your stuff. You actually hire these workers for the association action, where you only start with one, but you can slowly get more, which will help you repeat that action more often. These cubes are also used during that phase as well, and as you remove them, they increase what you'll get during your income phase, which I'll explain a little bit later. Finally, you may notice that some areas like here are in a darker purple. That's because as you play, these actions have the chance to be upgraded. When they are upgraded, not only are the actions themselves stronger, but certain areas of your board, as well as the other board, can't be interacted with until you've upgraded the action. For example, right here, you can put tokens in these two spots, but you cannot put two up here until this action has been upgraded. By the way, as you can see here, when you cover up anything yellow on your board, that is a instant bonus. Like that would be actually upgrading the action, which maybe you can use right away to fill out more spaces. Now I'm going to dive a little bit more into the association action because, like I said, it has you interact with a whole separate board here. Now, depending on the strength, you can choose actions equal to or less than. This is simply increasing in a reputation track we'll get to later. This is partnering up with the zoos. You put them in the location of the similar token size. This means animals from those areas will be cheaper. This is partnering with universities. They give some sign symbols, as well as that you hold on more cards during the cleanup phase. And finally, this is where you do conservation acts to help you gain those conservation points. You will start with some at the bottom of the game. These are basic ones. Almost all of them involve requiring certain symbols in your zoo, and if you are able to do so, you will be able to put a little token there, gaining those conservation points. However, there are some conservation projects within the main deck of cards. When you take this action, you can play them from your hand in order to be able to get those as well. And if you have the upgraded version, you can then pay a little bit extra to get some bonus points along the way. As you can see, now we have zoomed out and there's so much more that takes up the table. This is your personal play area that I was talking about where you choose actions. This was specifically for the association action, but this is the main board that is not only for keeping score, but is where you'll have your display of cards from a deck of over 200 unique cards. Now, as you upgrade some of these cards, not only will you be able to draw from that deck, you'll be able to interact and play cards from this tableau directly, depending on your reputation. This track is right here, and depending on your reputation, not only do you get bonuses, but you may interact with the cards at or below in case you really needed that Tasmanian Devil. Before we get to scoring though, I want to look at this symbol right here. This is the break track. Whenever you take certain actions, mostly the drawing cards as well as the sponsor action to give you some money, this will move down. When this hits here, this is pretty much forcing everyone into a cleanup phase where you'll discard your hand size, refill the association board, and also gain your income, be it basic money or some other cards that may give more unique forms of income. This does not trigger endgame in any way though. This just sort of is like giving a break, so to speak, throughout the game. Endgame comes from the scoring. You see, the scoring is made up of two parts: the appeals track, that's these tickets here, and the conservation track, that's these green parts here. You actually have two different forms of victory points. As the two approach each other, certain things are going to trigger. As you move along the conservation track, this is where you might get some bonuses. These are actually first come, first serve. When you actually hit here, the two secret goals you're going to be given at the beginning, you will have to discard one, so choose whichever one is going best with your current strategy. Meanwhile, this one is determining your income, your basic income of how much money you will get depending on your appeal. But once the two finally meet up, that is what triggers endgame. If they meet up or pass, the person finishes their turn, all other players get a turn as well, and then you go directly to endgame scoring. First, you're going to trigger things like those final goals I mentioned before. There are some cards that may have similar things on there as well, such as this penguin pool gives you some points at the end. Then finally, this is the interesting part. Depending on where your markers are, you're going to look at the lowest appeal score where your conservation marker is. So in this case, 85. Subtract that from where your actual appeal score marker is. Whoever has the highest positive score is the actual winner. All right, so I know that's a lot to take in and not just a lot of table space. There are a lot of intricacies here, and I'm sure anyone who's actually played the game is going to be asking why I skipped over a little specific interaction and rules. A big example, which will come up a bit later, is there are going to be cards such as this Indian Cobra here that actually trigger player interaction, either put tokens on their actions, punishing them, or maybe stealing a card or something from them instead. Those aren't that heavy in the deck, but there are enough in there, and that's a lot of your interactions outside of the usual, I take the card you wanted kind of thing. There's also going to be unique special pens for certain animals, if they're reptiles or birds, or a petting zoo, and there's also other cards and what they mean with each other. And luckily, if this is sounding like too much, I will say at the very least, this game has a special glossary, and the cards have a ID number that for the most part, you can look up whatever the issue is in like a clarification. So there wasn't too much in terms of stopping play and trying to find out what's going on, or having us have to actually take out our phones to Google what the actual answer was. That all said, I do have a pretty quick way to test if you would like this game or not. Depending on how you feel about Terraforming Mars, that should probably tell whether you find this game to be enjoyable or not. It has a lot of similar things. You are playing a lot of cards on a tableau. It is not a short game. It's going to take a few hours, and you are building up a score until you sort of hit that point of no return, and then everyone quickly tries to get past those final points as they can. Now, hold it. I already hear a lot of you yelling at me that is completely different, and that is true. It has many different intricacies. There are the cards play a bit more set collecty than Terraforming Mars. Both have symbols and play off each other's symbols, but I feel Terraforming Mars is interact more in an engine. This feels more rewarding in terms of collecting them, which is why there are more cards that are actually about releasing animals back into the wild, and those don't feel nearly as punishing. And of course, in Terraforming Mars, you're competing against each other in that central board, which you have to try to decide, I need to plant more things there than you to get those points. You have your own little zoo. You need to learn how to manage it. You don't have to worry about at least anyone mucking that up. Even the player interactions I mentioned before, they're not designed to really, I want to say, actually stop your strategy. They'll trip you up in terms of maybe making something a bit more expensive for a little bit while, but all of those clear almost all the time during the break. And of course, the big thing is most of them, I can't remember all of them, like I said, unique, are designed to really target whoever's ahead of you in points. So the person who's ahead can't use it to snowball and trip up people behind them, but is a great way for you to catch up to who's ahead. But not in a way that at the very least makes you feel bad for being in first and that you're going to be dogpiled on. The scoring system is something I really enjoy too, not in the sense that I think it really made a unique system. I do feel I'm not sure exactly because there were some times that it didn't happen, but it seems like the first to match up had a pretty good head start because that usually meant that they're probably going to be positive, so that at least they weren't negative. But I love the idea of when you start in the beginning, because if you look at this board, there you start on the opposite ends, and if you feel like it's going to take forever, which might be actually an accurate prediction of trying to get to the other end and match up. But, as people get closer, you're going to be like, if I gain 4 more conservation points, that will end the game. But if I gain the tickets and appeal first, I'm going to actually have a higher score. And you also just see all the gears turning in everyone's head of how they can squeeze out those final points before someone triggers endgame. And I really like that because it really, I felt like, gave you enough time to really build up the zoo and gave you sort of the initiative, so to speak, to do so. Hypothetically, someone could rush this and make this a much quicker game. I would not be surprised. My playgroup's not like that. We love to see how many points we can get and how big of a zoo can be. So I really enjoyed the system in terms of scoring. And it is a little weird when you see everyone's markers and then all said and done, you see an 11, maybe a 20 or something, not nearly as high scores. The journey to actually reaching that end game scoring is also a blast. Playing all these cards, at least for me, I love it. I love collecting all these cards, all these cool animals. Sure, they don't actually give me a little entry about the animals like I love in Wingspan, but I still get these cool pictures of the animals at least. Even some of the animals, but the sponsors feel a little bit, and this goes a little bit back to Terraforming Mars, but like they're out of a textbook. Which I found a little bit funny. But the weird interaction, they have so many weird symbols and it's almost clunky how many weird symbols and wordings and abilities like pouch or initiative or scavenging. It feels sort of like I'm playing with a hodgepodge of different expansions almost all at once. And that's not too much of a bad thing if you're that kind of person. I am. I like seeing how many weird interactions happen, and this game has brought animals from all over the world to do it. And the actions to do them themselves, I don't know how I feel about this. I'm mostly positive. I like this idea of having to decide, do I wait till I get it to the 5 slot there? Or do I do it now because I really want to play this animal out for its ability? Definitely something, that part I do enjoy. The problem is they're expensive. In particular, animals, build, association, and technically cards. Because the association is the biggest vendor. You need workers to do it. So when you start the game, you only have 1. So until you lock another worker, which is not easy unless you really beeline to it, I feel. Once you do that, that action's a dead card. So if it hits the 5 slot again, it's sort of a pain. You have to give up a turn to get a small bonus to move it to the back. It's not something I really enjoy. The others aren't as bad, but the same thing can happen. Animals are not cheap, even in the upgrade version of the sponsors, which is a really good way to get money outside of the income phase. Rarely can you earn enough money from that to buy an animal. In the lineup right now, there are 3 animals that are relatively cheap. Some of the bigger ones, like 20, there's 30s, like the elephant. The most this can get without using a lot of tokens to boost it or some other weird effect is 10. So it's not, once you usually do the animal actions, you play 2 animals, you're like, that's what I'm playing this round. I just got to hope that I don't need to build anything, which also uses money. The cards one is more weird because of the very small hand size of 3, possibly 5, depending on what you get to upgrade. The problem with that one more comes along when usually the other ones are dead, and you're like, if I draw, I'm just going to discard it anyway. And if I like what's already in my hand, I don't want to draw something I like. The sponsor card in particular, I think, is actually the exception to the rule. In fact, really carries the weight here because unlike the other cards, which can sort of become undesirable regardless of the situation, usually because you're out of resources, if you don't have a sponsor card to play with the sponsor card, instead you can just gain money. And I like that a lot. it is helpful because the resource it gets makes it possible to actually play the other cards. You do have the option to take an action and just gain one of these little bonus tokens, which you can use to power up an action later. But it doesn't matter how powerful an animal action is if you have no money. The sponsor action is the only thing that either rewards you for playing itself or helps you play another card in the future. I feel like I now just went bashing the action cards and making it sound a lot worse, but I still love it a lot because that dead time is not nearly as common, because usually that means the round is almost already at a close, and if a break occurs, you get your resources back, you get your worker back, and you don't have to worry too much. And in particular, those dead times, which feel like somewhat wasted terms, are a little sad, aren't nearly as bad as analysis paralysis. Every game has it. This one's definitely going to have a lot of complications, but I feel with the way that they have that gallery book and the wording on a lot of the cards, honestly also these trays here, trying to hold them up without spilling everything, really help keep the gameplay moving at a good pace, that even though I've been sitting at the table for multiple hours, I'm having honestly almost as much fun as I would be if I actually went to the zoo. Crits and misses for Ark Nova. Crits. They included over 200 unique cards for you to mess around with, which I unbelievably enjoy, especially mostly the animals, because I just like seeing their pictures. But the different sets you can collect and different symbols really allow for you to go for different strategies and honestly pivot relatively well. If you started with a reptile strategy, it's not hard for you to change into a predator one if the cards come up. The scoring system having two different kinds of victory points actually works really well. What this does is it adds an interesting tempo in which the players are a bit more in control of how long the game will end. This isn't too apparent in the beginning. You just feel like that won't happen for a long time. But as the pieces start to approach each other, you're going to be a bit more careful in how you play your cards, and that is when you're going to try to squeeze out those extra little bits of points for that efficiency before the game ends. Oftentimes I'll say a crit, but I will then bring it up in a miss and how it doesn't work. This one's a little bit the opposite, so it'll make more sense once you hear all the misses. This game is a bit complicated and janky at times, but I feel that the designers understood that, and they went with the path that I respect of not trying to cut down on the stuff, but rather they went with trying to make sure it is as clean as possible for you to get through it. They made great organizations. They have extra books for you to make sure to read up and clarify any cards. It's obvious they didn't just want to make their big, heavy animal-themed game, but to make one that ran smoothly. I enjoyed the player interaction in this. I don't mind usually having a solo style game, but there are multiple cards in here that are designed to trip up players, and in particular, they work very well because they only target those ahead of you. That means if you're in the lead, they are not nearly as strong, so you can't just keep punching down, while if you're behind, it's a great way to attack those in front of you and maybe catch up. Misses. The miss that explains the crit. This game does feel a bit clunky. There's so many weird interactions, specific words, rules, symbols. There are unique weird goals, as well as symbols just for petting zoos and bears. I feel like I'm playing with multiple mini expansions that could have actually been cut out, and I don't think it would have hurt the game too much, and maybe for some players would have helped let them focus more clearly on what kind of goals and sets to collect. All the actions are extremely resource hungry. This wouldn't be too bad, except once you play a couple of these once, maybe twice, the action doesn't do much for you. Because the actions take up a slot, once they get to the high end, if you cannot pay for them, it's going to feel like a dead end. The biggest offender of this was association action, which is almost impossible and nothing you can do until you have workers. You only start with one worker in the beginning, so until you lock another one, that's pretty much a one and done action. I want to go back to comparing this to Terraforming Mars because when we first played this in our group, with the exception of one person who had not played Terraforming Mars, many of us said, oh, this really feels like it. And I was actually shocked when I looked online and I saw a lot of people being very adamant that it is not like it. And reading from what they said, I get where they're coming from, and agree with a lot of their points. Terraforming Mars definitely, while both are laying down cards and collecting a lot of symbols, Terraforming Mars is I feel like the cards you're playing are more about the engine you're building. You're making it so from now on, every power symbol, every time you do the power resource, you gain an extra 2 or something. When this feels like it's focusing solely on the set collecting aspect and trying to get those victory points a bit more, like the card's purpose is always there for that. This leads to different interactions, both positive and negative, in terms of what cards come out and what's useful. I think that's a different dive and would require me to play a bit more Terraforming Mars and maybe do an official side-by-side game review. But needless to say, I feel in this, at the very least, most cards are somewhat playable, as long as you have the space for them in your zoo. In particular, I felt pretty easy to actually do multiple strategies, or at least pivot from birds, where I was drawing a lot of birds, but then they stopped showing up, to maybe reptiles, because that's what came up for me. And another thing with Terraforming Mars is I feel the player interaction comes a bit more from the competition of resources, either the territory on Mars or the goals. While this has similar goals, you can find a lot more goals and more public goals from out there, so I don't think they're nearly as limited. And of course, you have your own play mat, so there is much more of a focus on what you build rather than worrying about how your opponents may take up an area that you were planning to build on. That all said, I do feel both games, while maybe have a bunch of mechanical differences, both go for that same itch. They are that kind of long game with a bunch of really unique cards that are random, but it's up to you to choose the path, collect the ones that are best from you, and really try to carve out your way to victory in a very long but enjoyable process. It is a game in which I feel that if you were to own both, and let's say that eventually you did a board game culling, I feel these two games would be fighting each other for a slot on that proverbial arc that is your board game shelf. And that's not itself a bad thing. I mean, there are plenty of games out there that I think that are similar and you can enjoy that. Maybe if you're not a space theme, you can go for this one if you enjoy animals more, or vice versa. And in particular, I think just sitting around and playing this alone, I've had a blast. The cards, the randomness, I know for a lot of people that would be considered more of a miss, that they don't like what can come up and it's completely random, especially because it's unique. But for me, that clunkiness actually works out really well. It reminds me when I take a bunch of cards from a trading card game and seeing how sets that are years apart interact with each other, and you just have just a crazy mash and just a blast seeing how everything comes together. And it's the same reason like Terraforming Mars too. It's just so many weird stuff going on, and it's just so fun to see what you build from it. And for me, I am hype-wise, I don't know if this is the next game that will completely change the world, or whether it be the marketplace, getting new people in, or completely innovative. But this is one that I love, and I had a blast playing the entire time. And it's not one that I think is going to leave my shelf soon. The only thing I would worry about this game when it came to making sure it came out at game night would be if we had enough time to experience it from start to finish. Let me know what your thoughts on this game are if you've played it. Do you think I'm crazy for seeing some of these connections to Terraforming Mars that they are nothing alike? Or do you think that they may be closer than they seem? And what are your thoughts, though, on how hot and how many people have fallen in love with this? Do you think it was all useless hype? Or do you think Ark Nova truly deserves the awards and the inevitable top 10s it's going to get at the end of the year? I'd love to hear from you. And of course, I appreciate it if you could give it a like and subscribe. And if you think someone would be interested in watching this video, please send it and share it with them. Until then, I'm Will. This has been Roll for Crit.